The United States Department of State did something it rarely did. It put a $2 million bounty on a single man's head. To put that in perspective, back in 1990, the average price of a house in America was about $100,000. That bounty could have bought 20 homes outright. This wasn't just a reward. It was a desperate signal from a superpower that was losing a war it didn't even know how to fight. The man they wanted wasn't hiding in a basement or a suburban safe house. He was sitting on a throne in a jungle kingdom, protected by an army of 20,000 soldiers. His name was Khun Sa, and for a long time, he was the most successful businessman you've never heard of. The problem wasn't just that he was selling a product, it was the sheer scale of it. If you were in New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles in the mid-'80s, and you saw a specific brand of white powder hitting the streets, usually marked with a WO Globe stamp, there was a 60% chance it came from this one man's backyard. He wasn't just a supplier, he was the market. While the American government was spending billions on enforcement, Khun Sa was making enough money to build schools, hospitals, and paved roads in a corner of the world that didn't even appear on most maps. He wasn't just a warlord, he was a ghost in the American living room, an invisible hand reaching from the mountains of Southeast Asia into the veins of the Western world. But here is the detail that sticks in the throat of every investigator who worked the case. Khun Sa didn't think he was a villain. He didn't see himself as the architect of a crisis. To him, the thousands of lives being lost in American cities were just a statistic of a foreign market. He once told a journalist, with a completely straight face, that he was the George Washington of his people. He claimed he was fighting for the independence of the Shan State, a rugged, mountainous region between Myanmar and Thailand. The illicit trade? To him, that was just his tax base. It was the only way he could afford to buy the surface-to-air missiles and the hardware he needed to keep his people free. It's a chilling bit of logic. He took the struggle of American inner cities and used it to fuel a revolution in the jungle. He lived in a world where survival wasn't about laws, but about who had the most firepower and the best distribution network. He wasn't some uneducated thug. He was a master of political theater. He knew exactly how to play the media, how to play the local governments, and most importantly, how to play the demand. The US authorities were obsessed with him, but they couldn't touch him. He was a shadow over the country, a ghost in the machine of the global economy. They tried everything: diplomacy, pressure on local governments, undercover stings. But every time they thought they had a lead, they realized they weren't dealing with a simple criminal. They were dealing with a head of state who just happened to be the world's biggest trafficker. He had his own flag, his own anthem, and his own justice system. But even the most powerful kings have a weak point, and Khun Sa's wasn't money or power. It was something much more human, something hidden deep in his past, in the way he was raised in the lawless mountains of the Shan State. He thought he was untouchable behind his wall of soldiers and his mountain fortresses. He didn't realize that the very people he claimed to be protecting were starting to look at him not as a savior, but as a target. And as the 1990s began, a secret meeting was taking place that would change everything, starting with a message that arrived at a US embassy, a message that wasn't a threat, but a stunning invitation to do the unthinkable. The message sitting on a desk at the US Embassy in Bangkok was a total bombshell. Khun Sa, the man the DEA called the Prince of Death, was making an offer that sounds like something out of a high-stakes thriller. He wanted to sell the United States his entire inventory of the product. All of it. He was asking for $2 billion over 8 years to shut down his operations and retire. To him, this wasn't a confession. It was a business exit strategy. He viewed himself as a legitimate political leader who just happened to deal in an unfortunate commodity. Think about the sheer audacity of that for a second. While families in Chicago and San Francisco were being torn apart by the white powder flowing out of the Golden Triangle. The man at the top was treating their suffering like a line item on a corporate budget sheet. He lived in a mountain headquarters called Ho Mong. This wasn't some dirt floor camp. It was a fully functioning city with satellite TV, its own power grid, and even a soda bottling plant. While the international community saw a kingpin, the local villagers saw a man who paved their roads and built their schools. This is the core of the warlord's paradox. He used tactical empathy. He didn't just want power, he wanted the moral high ground. He'd sit in his garden, sipping tea and talking about the independence of his people with the sincerity of a founding father. But that mountain paradise was bought and paid for by a global crisis. Every schoolhouse he built was funded by the very substance that was fueling a rise in crime and tragedy across the ocean. By the early 90s, Khun Sa's operation was so efficient it was terrifying. He controlled about 60% of the world's supply. To put that into perspective, imagine if one single person owned every single gas station across the entire United States. That's the kind of market dominance we're talking about. The street price of the product in New York was hitting record lows because he was flooding the zone. It was a supply-side economic miracle that was actually a human catastrophe. If his empire had been a legitimate corporation, it would have comfortably sat in the Fortune 500. But the walls were starting to close in. The Burmese government was tired of his state within a state, and the Americans weren't interested in his buyout offer. They didn't want to pay him to stop. They wanted him to face the consequences in a courtroom. But here is where the psychology of a man like Khun Sa gets complicated. He had spent years telling his soldiers they were fighting for a noble cause, the freedom of the Shan people. But as the 90s rolled on, those soldiers started looking around. They saw Khun Sa living in luxury while they lived in the mud. They saw that the revolution looked a lot more like a massive logistics company. A rift was forming, and a young officer in his inner circle was starting to ask questions that couldn't be answered with a charismatic speech or a handful of cash. While the world's most advanced satellites were busy tracking his movements from space, the real silent witness to his downfall was much smaller. It was a simple handwritten ledger that had quietly gone missing from his office, a book that contained every name, every payoff, and every secret route used to move the poison across the globe. This wasn't just a list of numbers, it was a roadmap to his destruction. And as the internal pressure reached a breaking point, Khun Sa made a decision that would shock even his closest allies. He wasn't going to fight a war he couldn't win. He was going to do something much more calculated, something that would leave the international community reeling and his own people feeling like they'd been sold to the highest bidder. But the biggest mystery wasn't where he was going. It was what he had left behind in those mountains. He wasn't going to fight a war he couldn't win. He was going to do something much more calculated, something that would leave the international community reeling and his own people feeling like they'd been sold to the highest bidder. But the biggest mystery wasn't where he was going. It was what he had left behind in those mountains. In January 1996, the world expected a massive final stand. The DEA had a $2 million bounty on Khun Sa's head. To put that in perspective, in the mid-90s, $2 million could buy you roughly 20 high-end luxury homes or fund a small army's logistics for months. He was the most wanted man on the planet, the individual responsible for a massive percentage of the substances hitting American streets. But instead of the expected tragedy, the Opium King simply walked out of the jungle. He didn't come out in handcuffs, and he didn't come out in a pine box. He came out as a businessman closing a deal. He had brokered a secret agreement with the Myanmar military government. It was the ultimate betrayal. For years, he had framed himself as a revolutionary, a man fighting for the independence of the Shan people. Then, in a heartbeat, he traded their loyalty for a comfortable retirement. He handed over his heavy weaponry, his mountain strongholds, and thousands of his soldiers. In return, he didn't get a prison cell. He got a luxury villa in Yangon, a fleet of expensive cars, and a complete guarantee that he would never be handed over to the United States. The psychological profile here is chilling. Khun Sa was never a martyr. He was a pragmatist with a massive ego. He had what we call selective empathy. He would fund a local hospital to maintain his image as a savior. But the moment the walls closed in, he didn't hesitate to leave his troops in the mud to face the fallout alone. The silent witness to this betrayal was found at his former headquarters in Hmong. When investigators finally entered, they didn't find the ruins of a desperate battle. They found half-finished meals and personal items left on desks. It looked like a workplace where everyone had just stood up and walked away. There was no struggle because the man at the top had already signed the paperwork to sell the building. While the world's governments celebrated the end of his reign, they missed the bigger picture. They thought by removing the figurehead, the trade would collapse. They were wrong. Khun Sa didn't destroy the system. He just transitioned into a silent partner. In Yangon, he ran legitimate-looking businesses, real estate, construction, and transportation, while the infrastructure he built in the Golden Triangle continued to hum. Today, the legacy of that surrender is still felt. The trade didn't stop, it just changed its face. The heroin he once controlled has been largely replaced by synthetic substances, products that are cheaper to manufacture and far more potent. The routes he carved through the dense jungle are the same ones used today for a multi-billion-dollar illicit economy. Khun Sa passed away in 2007, not in a shootout or a jail cell, but in his own bed, surrounded by wealth. He proved a terrifying point. If you make yourself powerful enough and your pockets deep enough, the law doesn't come for you with a warrant. It comes to you with a contract. He's gone, but the Golden Triangle remains a void on the map where the rules don't apply. A kingdom he built that outlasted the king himself. The tragedy isn't just what he did, but the fact that he was allowed to walk away from it all, leaving the rest of the world to deal with the evidence.